Everyone, for this first panel, fusing the physical, digital, and the biological, AI's transformation of healthcare. We have Gabe Ott. He's the co-founder and CEO of Freenome. Prior to that, age 17, he was hired as an engineer at Apple, where he helped bring about the first iPhone. We also have Jack Young joining us, who's a partner and head of venture capital at Deutsche Telekom Capital Partners, ranked number 2 on the Global Corporate Venturing's Rising Star list of 2016. Matthew Zieler is the founder and CEO of Clarify, which he founded shortly after completing his PhD at NYU. We also have moderating Nick Romeo. Nick covers culture and ideas for publications like the National Geographic, Washington Post, New Yorker, and The Atlantic. Please help me welcome them up.
Good morning.
It's very bright here. It's better than outside.
Yeah. So am I audible? Sounds like this is okay? Okay, so I was going to start with just a quick anecdote. If you'll go back with me to the year 1881, President Garfield was shot in Baltimore, Maryland, and he languished for quite a while before dying. His assassin had this kind of unprecedented defense, which was basically like, I didn't kill him, the doctors did. So what happened, apparently, there were 2 bullet wounds. One of them, they were incapable of finding where the bullet was. So Alexander Graham Bell actually developed a metal detector and was using it on Garfield, right, as if it were like a beach and he was searching for treasure. So he used it, and he was not able to find the bullet. And apparently the reason was that the doctors were so convinced that it was on one side of the body when in fact it was on the other, that they simply never scanned the relevant side. I don't know if it was right or left, but this is sort of like a parable of doctor error or something, and it's still quite relevant if any of you have read the new Michael Lewis book, The Undoing Project, which is a sort of redux of the work of Kahneman and Tversky, these Israeli psychologists, kind of the founders of behavioral economics. They have a nice anecdote, one of many, where they talk about the overconfidence of doctors, and basically they give a bunch of x-rays to doctors who are trained diagnosticians and who you would think would be very good at assessing their own level of competence in diagnosing something and knowing what they don't know. In fact, they're not even self-consistent, right? So they might say, oh, look, I think this is X, and then the next time they're given the exact same data set, they'll say, oh no, this is Y. So there might be something here that, the conclusion might seem like, oh, look, digital salvation, machine learning can come in and eradicate human bias and error. I think people on the panel have somewhat different views as to the likelihood of that possibility. So that's one thing we're going to get to. But I'd just like to sort of close this little intro by saying there are reasons to be skeptical of that narrative. I think one is that, there are maybe more systematic irrationalities in the healthcare system, one of which might just be that, we still spend something like 90% of all healthcare spending on the last 6 months of life, right? Another would be something that you see already in responses to things like self-driving cars. Even if fatality rates are dramatically lower, you're still gonna have the kind of human impulse to be afraid of being killed by a machine. So with that sort of parable narrative to open things off, I guess I would like to just start by asking people to comment on human irrationality and the potential for AI, digital, whatever kind of buzzwords you want to overcome those irrationalities. So maybe I'll start with you, Gabe.
My comment on human irrationality,
Yeah.
I think it exists.
Yeah.
I think it's very real. I think machine learning, deep learning, AI, whatever you call it, I think applied in the proper way in healthcare will save lives. I think there's a lot of debate around, how regulated should this be, how thoroughly tested these systems should be before we launch it live. I'm definitely on the side of we should take this step by step, because yes, we may get there if we get rid of all these regulations and we just launch these learning engines. and start treating people based on the results of these learning engines. But how many people are going to die before we get to that end stage of where we're saving more lives than what we're doing today? That's really where I stand on that whole issue. So I think regulations do exist for good reasons. I don't agree with all the regulations that exist, but I'm also not of the opinion that we should just release these machine learning engines without doing the proper testing, without doing the proper regulatory clearance.
Do you guys want to comment on?
Yeah, I think the AI in healthcare is a very broad use cases, right? So we have to take a stage approach, I agree. So human life are a treasure, right? And we can't afford mistakes. So the way that I see is doctors not going away anytime, right? So what I believe is AI is probably not going to be the front line, maybe on the fringe. We already see AI applications in certain areas which could be more subjective rather than objective. For example, applications on dermatology, right? So if you have a mole, you can easily do image recognition, say whether this is need to be immediate attention or not. But other areas, for example, cancer diagnosis, I don't think you can just feed a bunch of data and says, doctor decide what this is. So I believe the AI is going to take its time to work into that. The area I think AI, it's going to be a very useful immediately is dealing with the shortage of care, especially in the aging population. So you probably know, most people know, United States, unlike Japan, we still have 12% of people are 65 and older, and in about 10, 15 years, when some of the folks in this room going to retire, unfortunately, one-fifth of the United States citizens going to be 65 and older, and seniors need lots of cares, and companionship is a big thing, right? So it's not feasible if you look at the population expansion of that way to have a direct contact with human for the benefits the seniors enjoy today. So you will see now AI's chatbot, companion, robotics step in. So I think that's probably the first area we can looking for adoption, wide adoption, which is very practical and probably lower risk.
Do you have any thoughts? Yeah.
I think with AI, there's this big misconception that it's just going to replace everybody's job. And it goes from every level of jobs, from people labeling images. We deal with a lot of images and videos, so there's a lot of outsourced work that is done to label them so we can train on it. Or people were doing this in the past to organize their data. And so that's a lower level job than maybe a doctor who's been studying for a dozen years in order to be a specialist. And so people assume AI is just going to replace all these jobs, but really it's making these same workers just be better at their jobs, either more accurate or be able to apply their learnings to more data, and in the case of healthcare, more patients. So it's not about just correcting humans, but it's making them better and making them scale up much more better.
Or reduce their mundane task, right? For example, one of the things that for doctor today, I'm sure many of you have gone to see a primary care physicians, and typically you have a 10-minute session. Unfortunately, nowadays, a doctor oftentimes, instead of looking at you, the back is towards you because they have to type in EMRs, right? So the EHRs. So you probably know there's a San Francisco company leveraged, actually probably one of the only survivor for a real application for Google Glass. It's a company called Algomatics. I don't know if some of you heard about it. So what they do is actually play clever. To solve that problem is basically they have the Google Glass live stream back to an outside facility, oftentimes in India or Pakistan, that whereby they have scribers in the back. Not only are they taking the notes for the doctors, putting the EMRs, but also whisper to the doctor's ear, say, hey, maybe you should talk about this. Maybe you should code it this way, right? So that could be a very easy application that AI can step in, right? Transcribe and also prompt the doctors about codification. So make sure that the patients that receive the right type of treatment and the hospital systems that get reimbursed properly.
Okay, so I think that's a nice segue to the question of privacy. I mean, the idea of having a second set of eyes ghosting in and watching an entire medical interaction might give some people goosebumps. A sort of similar technology was actually a premise of a recent Black Mirror episode, if anyone enjoys that show. But if you guys, I know there are some different views on the panel about the sort of value of radical transparency in data. Maybe, Matt, if you want to talk a little about what you think the benefit of that would be, and then what, if any, downsides there might be to simply allowing all data to be analyzed by companies who presumably would increase the efficiency of medical processes.
Yeah, I'm under the opinion that opening up data is just going to benefit everybody, every single patient, to the doctors themselves, to the whole healthcare industry. We see this happen in all different industries. Think of Wikipedia. I'm sure everybody in the room has used it. It was created by all of us, and it's completely open, and they don't even make money off of it. And it benefits all of us much better than any one company with a siloed set of data and experts only in that company creating an encyclopedia. And so that is the potential to happen in healthcare if we can open up the data. And that doesn't mean leveraging people's names and all their private information. All we need is kind of a unique identifier, just a hash string that we can represent a single person with. So it doesn't have to expose your information.
I think there's two different things in there, actually. I think there's the shared data with everyone and everything being open, and then there's the facilitating sharing of data between entities like companies and academic institutions and hospitals. I definitely think we need to do a better job of being able to share research data, share clinical data with each other to facilitate research. I definitely disagree that all the data needs to be open in order to do that. I think that can be very harmful, not only to the patients. I mean, medical data is a very sensitive set of information for people. There's a lot of things that get discussed within between a patient and a clinician that should be kept between those two people. And the idea or the concept of having that completely be open, like Wikipedia, is I think quite worrisome to not only individuals, but also to the clinicians who are trying to do their best to practice medicine in the most responsible way possible.
Well, I think in healthcare, it's actually this is very well regulated, at least in the United States, right? There's HIPAA regulations versus a consumer places. There's lots of concerns because it's not regulated. So here, it's relatively people respect how to use the data and anonymize it so that it can be using for the good of the society for research, and also at the permission of the patient, they can go deep, wide as they want, right? Because imagine the first time a patient get diagnosed with cancer, all of a sudden, right? Every single data, every pieces that she or he has are very much willing to share because this is a life and death situation. And once people realize these data are crucial, over the time, societies will be more open to people willing to share, right? For example, I've done the 4 sequence, right? So it's sitting there, and it's a big trove of data, right? It's probably now millions of people are doing that, but it's just sitting there. So the people are now just thinking about how we can donate those data, right, for the good of the society for research. I think over the time, as the generation move on, people are more and more open about that.
So Gabe, since it seems like you might be somewhat of the skeptical voice in the panel, could you give us a few examples of why you find it worrisome, this idea of radical transparency of data? What are some of the problems specifically?
So sensitive things get discussed between a doctor and their patient, right? The doctor-patient confidentiality exists for a reason, right? We need as much truthful information as possible from the patient in order to diagnose patients properly, right? If we had this understanding that everything that we're saying to the doctor is going to somehow be released to the public or is going to be open for other people to access, patients already lie. Right, patients already try to bend the truth to make themselves appear in sort of a better light as it is when they go to the doctors. And the concept of having sort of radical transparency around that, I think, will actually break diagnostic medicine as it stands today.
That's interesting. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I mean, that might be true if it's just considering the data you get from talking to the doctors, but hopefully in the future, more technology is going to be collecting new devices, like the Black Mirror reference was a good one because I love that show, and the technology there is not that far off, but it's about this world of immersive technology that's always watching you, collecting data. And so you can't lie in some sense. If you have the ground truth data, you would actually know exactly what the issue is, everything you've done in the past. So yeah, there's
I don't think it's unprecedented that analytical data can't be fudged. I'm pretty sure people can fudge that data too. But on top of that, you're sort of proving my point in terms of these things have to be done stepwise. if those sensors, and you're talking about ambient sensors existing to monitor people's health, if those exist and if that's what is legal and that's what everyone has essentially agreed to do, I agree, then we can maybe make those kinds of data more accessible in an anonymized way to facilitate research. We're not there yet. So the concept of doing radical transparency within the system that we currently have today, I think is going to be more detrimental to the patient than helpful.
Also, maybe just worth noting that Black Mirror is a dystopian show, and largely about how terrible it would be to live in such a world. Okay, well, so speaking of terrible dystopian outcomes, maybe we could talk a little about the possibility of being killed by a machine, and what sort of, because this comes up a lot with the self-driving car thought experiments, where there's a car out of control and it can either kill a bunch of school children or the driver, and you have the sort of utilitarian philosopher would say, well, it should kill the driver, but then the kind of intrinsic human horror at being killed by a machine is such that now a lot of people are just saying, oh, well, this thought experiment itself shows that we shouldn't move forward with self-driving cars. I think there are lots of analogies in the medical domain. If you guys have thoughts on, I guess, the fear that might be engendered by entrusting very important either procedures or diagnoses to AI, and whether that fear is justifiable.
Well, so the concept of cancer diagnostics and AI and cancer diagnostics was brought up earlier. And of course, I disagree because I run a company that does cancer diagnostics based on artificial intelligence or deep learning algorithms. But I think we should also keep in mind that all diagnostics is subjective today. It's basically up to the doctor, based on the evidence that they have, what the final diagnosis is and the follow-up treatments are. Because no diagnostic test, whether it's a blood test or even an invasive biopsy, is actually deterministic in terms of whether somebody has cancer or not. Right? So the concept of having an artificial intelligence make that decision is still many, many, many years away, if that's ever going to happen. I think machine learning, artificial intelligence can do a much better job of giving the clinicians better information, more informative information with which they can make a final diagnosis. But it's still very subjective. So I don't think machine learning is necessarily going to change how that's done. I don't think people are going to be killed here by machines in the medical context. I think it's going to be clinicians who either misinterpret the data or the learning engine giving less than accurate information. But neither of those are really artificial intelligence necessarily killing people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of autonomous driving, people are still getting used to it, right? How many people actually are comfortable get on the highway using auto cruising? Show of hands. Anybody has Tesla? I see one or two hands. I'll tell you, I drive 50% of the time. I get on the highway. I use autonomous driving these days. It's wonderful, but just don't read your email. So people actually in healthcare, believe it or not, this concept of autonomous driving has been there for a long time, for people that unfortunately have a cardio condition, right? There's a thing called the pacemaker, right? Which is being around for 30, 40 years now, right? Think about that basically monitors every single heartbeat of yours, right? In the events that your heart having trouble to maintain that rhythm, that kicks in right away. And the technology is so advanced now, you can implant that device, a tiny little one, it's probably a stack of 2 quarters. That device can last 7, 8 years. And monitor every single heartbeat of yours, right? Now, so think about that compared to autonomous driving. It's a magnitude of differences here. It maintains your life. So people are already happy with that, right? So in medical field, there's lots of things that AIs, that people hasn't really talked about, but these forms exist, and people has been embraced for many, many years, because you're dealing with a life and the death situation. When you're dealing with that, it's not a luxury, it's a must.
Did you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. I think I agree with the other panelists. I think today it's not, AI is not going to change medicine, but in the future I do think there's going to be less subjectivity and more concrete results coming from AI, just because there's going to be more data available and it's going to get smarter and smarter over time. And we're already seeing cases where it's actually working better than doctors in isolated environments. Not all different things that doctors can do, but in certain cases. For example, one company we work with in France has a device that goes on the back of your cell phone to look inside your eardrums and diagnose about 10 different diseases. And they have an app that doctors use in hospitals to diagnose it. That created training data that trained Clarify's platform. and now they're using our platform to recognize on new patients automatically and claiming over 99% accuracy in real-world data. And so that's much better than a doctor who gets tired and is emotional and has a subjective nature. So there's a lot of promise, but it can't solve everything yet.
Sure.
People are very skeptical about doing that, right? Just as simple as imagine you have an eardrum that people are taking a picture whether you have an infection or not. We heard an early iteration of that, this company that basically had this machine learning algorithm that basically you send in and the machine give you a response. This is a smartphone application. Within 30 seconds, the result come back a yes or no. And the feedback got is, whoa, the doctor's not looking into that. It's a machine. Do I really believe that? Believe it or not, that company has to put a damper, so delay that diagnosis for like 2 hours artificially, even though for 30 seconds. That just tells you, right, people, they still wanted the tailored care. They don't want to talk to a machine. But in reality, it's probably, in that situation, machines actually probably than doctor, because you look at millions of images instead of, the doctors sometimes do miss.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting points is like a doctor is going to go to school, they're going to have at some university, and then they're going to, my dad's a doctor, my brother's a doctor, so I know kind of firsthand, we grew up in a small town, so my dad was a family practitioner, and there's only 2,500 people in the town. So the most patients he could possibly see in his life is somewhere around 2,500 as they turn over and so forth. But if a machine could treat all those patients and every other person on the planet, so the 7+ billion people as training data in some sense. So there's a lot more information that goes through an AI platform than any single doctor.
I agree with what you're saying, I think, but the analogy is not exactly fair, right? Because if your entire sample size is 2,500 and those are the people that you're seeing, you're effectively seeing your entire sample size. So you're not really overfitting to the situation. I agree that in general that human beings, just like learning algorithms, can overfit. And if you're in a major metropolitan area and you're only seeing a few hundred patients a year, but the sample size is much larger, millions, and there could be a bunch of different scenarios happening, yeah, a single doctor is going to overfit to whatever he or she has seen.
Yeah.
And a learning engine that's able to see millions of data sets are less likely to do that. But I think that doctors and clinicians in a rural area, when they're pretty much seeing the entire population of who they're treating, I think they can be very effective in what they see.
Yeah. And
Yeah. Well, so I was just going to try to get to one other topic. Gabe and I were talking a little in the green room about a certain type of recklessness or irresponsibility that sometimes comes up when VCs and financial type folk see a possible investment in a disruptive technology, which AI in medicine certainly may be, and there's talking about the temptation to overfit or to fudge data or even just to willfully disregard data. I'm wondering if you could talk a little about some of your experience. I know you went to medical school. What are some of the dangers of people without a background? You mentioned the three-body problem. I'm thinking of that as well. People without a background in the sort of complex confluence of incentives that characterizes the medical world coming in and saying, oh yeah, everything is going to just, we're going to make this amount of profit, we're going to treat people as statistics, we're going to ignore data that suggests, this is not as effective as it might be because that could hurt earnings. So I guess the sort of basic incompatibility of profit motive with healthcare, I mean, this is a perennial theme in discussions of healthcare, but maybe exacerbated when you get billion-dollar valuations of AI healthcare companies.
Sure. I mean, there was a lot in that question.
Yeah.
I think on the academic research institution side, there is very little incentive for you not to fudge data, given how the research world is sort of created. We talk a lot about peer-reviewed journal articles and how they're sort of the standard of proper research being done. And of course, there's a lot written about how easy it is to get a peer-reviewed publication out. Mm-hmm. And so I don't necessarily see that as a gold standard, but also if the academic system is sort of structured in a way where if you don't publish, then you don't get the next grant. So there's really very little incentive for people not to fudge data because no tenured professor in the United States has ever been fired for scientific misconduct, right? So like there's really a sort of every incentive for people to sort of fudge data, and I've definitely seen this firsthand. I've certainly experienced it in that arena. So there's sort of that, those set of incentives. And then on the other side, there's the business, right, and VCs. And I think my worry there is a little bit different. I think there's a lot of people, especially on the tech side. I'm a Silicon Valley, I run a Silicon Valley company. I see this in the Valley all the time, where a bunch of people who are machine learning experts, who are computer scientists, try to get into this space and try to do something in biotech or life sciences without really understanding how that system works. So this is not necessarily willfully fudging data or doing bad research, but not heading into this space without understanding the system well enough. And I think machine learning, AI, they have their place, and they can be very effective when they're applied to solve the right solutions. But I think a lot of people are trying to do it in a way that's less than effective because they just don't understand the system.
Any examples that come to mind?
We were talking about this earlier, right? The concept of consumers paying for diagnostics is extremely flawed, I think. This idea that people are going to pay out of pocket to go and essentially get, at best, what's neutral news, right? You don't have that disease, is I think, asking people to change their behaviors a little bit too much. There are cultures around the world, I think Japan is a great example here, where people do go and get diagnostics done on a regular basis. They get physicals done on a regular basis, and they do that as a culture, and I think that's really great for them, and they're willing to pay for that. I think, especially in the United States, the consumers aren't there yet, but there's a lot of companies that are going into that space right now where they're trying to apply machine learning to a direct-to-consumer diagnostic solution, and they're finding that the business model just isn't working out as well as they would like to.
It doesn't scale, right? So you'll get early adopters, because typically when new things come out, like Kickstarter as a good example, you're always going to get, I find it's magical, you always get 30, 50,000 people. Maybe that's the early adopter percentage for every nook of interest. So you're going to get this early adoptions, but soon you find out that consumers in the United States are so conditioned that insurance pay for that, right? So the next question is, if it's good enough, why my insurance not paying for it, right? So that right there. So we did talk about healthcare. It's a big promise. Think about 18% of GDP is in healthcare. So no matter how you look at it, the venture investors join into that. But one of the things they don't realize, it's not like Google. The consumer decided, here's I want to go. I'm making my own decision. In healthcare, the consumer itself cannot make decisions. They're bounded by at least two forces. One is your physician has to prescribe that, and your payer has to agree to pay for that. So unless these three forces are somewhat aligned together, 3 Ps, sometimes people even say the 4 Ps, which is including the pharmaceutical companies, unless these things aligned, it's very hard to get one thing pushing through. As an investor, especially I was in early days in digital health, we learned a big way, right? We want to go bypass the other 2 Ps, directly go to the patient, and you find out you get the early adopters, soon you're going to hit the wall, and it's not going to scale. The answer to that is you say, we can try on some other much willing or systematically willing to self-pay societies like China, India, right? But in the United States, it's super difficult. It's very complicated. So the number one thing, whatever it's AI or machine learning, that if you were to have adoption, you have to go through the same process to figure out why the doctor want to do that, why the payer is willing to pay for that, and then finally how the patient will accept that.
Okay, Matt, did you want to jump in with anything?
I don't think I have anything.
Okay, I think maybe I'm supposed to go to questions, or, yeah? No.
No questions?
Yes. Oh, 1 second.
driving
Okay,
behavior?
so one other thing then, if we're waiting on questions. I would love to hear each of you maybe just talk briefly about, say, 15 to 20 years from now, if, I know it's necessarily speculative, but if you could sort of give a best case and a worst case scenario, just briefly, about what healthcare and some of these technologies we've been discussing, what that confluence might look like 15 to 20 years from now? Again, best case, worst case. Anyone want to start us?
Well, I think the first thing is today it's kind of ridiculous, right? Because you go see, and for the best behaved people, go see their doctor once a year, right? So the annual checkup, and even the checkup is incomplete, right? Because you did this and that. So what I see in 10, 15 years ago, your daily life is going to be monitored by all the sensors and all the technologies that we are available today. Just like your car is automatically monitored. Unfortunately, our life is unmonitored, right? So some people are more disciplined than the others. I see people wearing Fitbit, and people are getting up in the morning to do the right things. And my mom has, check out the ECG sensors, whatnot. So what I see is all the IoTs and the machine learning, big data learnings, AI. It's going to warm into our daily life. So what I believe in the 10, 15 years, we don't have the episode all of a sudden we have to rush into the emergency room unless you get hit by the car. So these things will be early, I see early diagnosis of any symptoms. So preventive measures be enacted before we have to go into a treatment. So I think we're right on the trajectory, and in 10, 15 years, we hopefully diabetes, preventive disease, lifestyle disease will be the history for human.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in the United States, we're one of the only nations that has for-profit payers. And so we have these guys that are reimbursing for our medical bills that needs to make money on their own, right? And so that's been the biggest struggle in companies and organizations trying to move towards preventative medicine. But preventative medicine is definitely where we need to head to, because I always really find this funny, because we go to the dentist, pretty much every year and get checkups and, get cavities fixed and all this stuff. But then we won't go to doctors for years, and then we get really, really sick, and then we go to the doctors and, say, make our bodies whole, right? We wouldn't not go to the dentist for many, many years and then tell the dentist, make my teeth perfect, right? So this need for preventive medicine is very real, and I think sensors will help with that. I think machine learning will make that, make use of that big data in a way that makes preventive medicine very effective, but also very cost effective for all parties involved, regardless of whether that's the company that's providing the product or the reimbursement groups that are actually paying for those preventive medicine functions to actually happen. So I think best case scenario, we would have figured out all that, and I think machine learning is going to be a facilitator of that to make it cost effective and incentivize everyone involved. Worst case scenario, I think we're going to move more and more towards sort of acute care, and we're going to be spending a lot more money on helping people die, which, as you mentioned, the vast majority of what we spend in healthcare today is helping people die.
Right.
And I think if we keep going the route that we're going, and if we can't figure out a better way to incentivize everyone to move towards preventative medicine, that's where we'll be in 10 years, where 100% of the cost that we have in healthcare is going to be spent on helping people die.
Okay, Matt?
I think I agree with both the other panelists. I think new devices like my Apple Watch is keeping track of my heart rate now. I never had that even a month ago. So it's happening now in small forms, but I think we'll have much more advanced devices on us, tracking us. But then in the hospital as well, I think robotics, I think, is going to play a huge role in medicine. The fine precision you can get out of a robotic arm versus somebody's shaking hand for surgery is very powerful. And you see this in like tele-robotics medicine. Already the doctors are using video game controllers to be better surgeons. So I think that's going to happen. And then when you think about that system, the doctor's seeing a screen. They're not actually in the room. They could be across the world and doing surgery. I think that's a perfect opportunity for AI, because that's the exact same setup that AI needs. It needs training data where it has some inputs and it has some outputs. So I'm optimistic that could even be automated in the future and be even more accurate than a physician.
Great. So in the last 38 seconds, I would love to hear from the audience.
Yeah, we'll
do
ask.
We have questions?
Yeah, we'll ask a few quick questions for the panel.
Yeah.
The first one is, what are some of the underutilized data sets in healthcare today?
The there are lots of data. In fact, the EMR has been, EHR has been around for a while. So if you go to see a doctor, there's a longitude of data, right? So if you, unfortunately, those data are locked in sometimes in one healthcare system. If you were to transfer to another, not all the histories are transferred to another. So we have that rich data for most of the American patients today. For the last couple of years, obviously your lab data that's available, right? So I mentioned earlier, there's selective few people, like fortunate one, already have a genomics data. So these data are available. The other thing is that, in fact, lots of disease are sort of a behavioral issues. So not only we can find a certain diagnosed person or providing better care through medical data we have, but we can also look at a behavior data, right? So marketing companies actually know lots of habits of yours. So we actually find company not only leveraging the data sets within the hospital system, but also the consumer data to help you to actually deliver better care to you or preventive measure.
Okay, great. So the next question is, a lot of the questions are sort of surrounding the culture of healthcare and the dealing with sort of the bureaucracy when it comes to selling to providers. How do companies approach selling to providers and dealing with the much slower pace of technology adoption in the healthcare industry?
Sorry, selling to who? I didn't.
Yeah, what was that?
How do companies deal with the slower technology adoption and the cultural issues around the bureaucracy in healthcare?
Sure. I think so. Our tests that we're developing are meant to be sold to clinicians to provide to their patients for cancer diagnostics. And in our experience, what works best is really focusing on data and to show them what this test does, how well it works, what are the sensitivity specificity numbers in terms of finding the disease or not, what are the false positive rates, and focusing really on what's called clinical validation, right, of whatever you're providing, less on how it works, and you start throwing around words like machine learning, deep learning, and things along those lines, and you just sort of see clinicians' eyes like glaze over, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not really the important part here, right? Like, yes, it's important to understand how the test works, and it's important to analytically validate that as much as possible. But the thing that the clinicians care more about is really how well is this test going to work, and is this test actually going to help me in saving this patient's life? And as long as you answer those questions with data, you're going to be able to sell a test that's based on machine learning engines or anything along those lines that's considered black box or new technology.
And the last question is directed towards Matt. Have you seen any image or video recognition use cases in healthcare where it currently isn't being used today, where it could significantly improve either the process or delivery of care?
Yeah, like I mentioned, that company out of France that we're working with that's diagnosing diseases inside your ear, that's capturing both image and video, which gives us lots of training data. We're working with some other companies that have huge databases that were created by doctors for different skin diseases and lesions and all that kind of stuff. It's a tough one because a lot of those different diseases look identical on the skin, and so you have to take into account a lot of other factors beyond just the image or the video. And so I think the ultimate AI in this space is going to take into account all different devices, data, past medical history, and whatever sensors you have at the moment to do this stuff.
Great, that's all the time we have for now.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.